So all people joined, I guess.
Yes.
So let us start. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Nygmet Ibadildin. I am chair of the Department of International Relations in Temur University. Title of our this roundtable is Kazakhstan and its new geopolitical realities. So Joanna, please, what is yours?
Thank you. Can you hear through the microphone?
You need to switch that on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Nygmet. Great introduction. A pleasure to be at KeyMap today, especially because I used to work here lecturing in journalism when I first moved to Almaty in 2005. So it's always a pleasure to be back in one of my favorite places. I'd like to start by thanking our hosts here at KeyMap, the China Central Asia Studies Center, Mariam for organizing and Elizabeth for organizing. Thank you very much. I'll try and keep my remarks below 10 minutes because we have a lot of interesting speakers. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how partnerships, relationships have shifted between Russia and Central Asia since February when Russia invaded Ukraine. So I'm going to just look at the question a little bit, introducing topics that I'm sure the other speakers will be returning to. Look at the question of whether Kazakhstan, especially as Russia's neighbor, the only one with a border with Russia, and the other Central Asian states, have they pivoted away from Russia? How has Russia's invasion changed views of Russia among governments in the region and among people in the region? So I'm going to start by pinpointing a few kind of emblematic moments that kind of make you think, wow, something is changing here, that we've seen over the last few months in Central Asia when the leaders have met at a sort of regional or even global level. And I'm also going to have a quick look at maybe domestic public opinion on the war, or at least what people are saying about the war and how things are changing in terms of what people say, think, and how, whether they're willing, and how willing they are to speak out in these countries. And then I'll be handing the floor to other speakers. So, emblematic moments. Well, for me, the first kind of really significant moment is probably the moment when Tokayev, Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, chose to stand up publicly to Vladimir Putin on a stage in St. Petersburg. Now, that happened in June at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, not very international this year, as you can imagine. You know, I think what was interesting there is Putin used that stage to outline his vision of an economic forum, to outline his vision of what he described as the former Soviet Union being historically basically Russia. Tokayev used that forum to outline Kazakhstan's position that Kazakhstan wouldn't be recognizing breakaway territories of Ukraine, and that Kazakhstan's position was based on, is based, indeed, on international law and on the UN Charter. Tokayev saying this, of course, as a former diplomat. Now, it's interesting and very emblematic to me because Tokayev and Putin were alone on that stage, apart from Margarita Simonyan, the chief editor of Russia Today, you know, the English language propaganda machine, basically of the Kremlin. So it's interesting that Tokayev felt able to push back so hard against what was basically an attempt to back him into a corner and make him agree that Kazakhstan would recognize the territories, or at least make him uncomfortable. So we saw from that these fictions that the war or invasion of Ukraine created for Kazakhstan and Russia kind of go public. It's not surprising, of course. Anybody sitting here in Kazakhstan in this room, and I'm sure most people watching on Zoom, know that if you share a 7,000-kilometer border with Russia and you have a large Russian minority, both of those things in common with Ukraine, watching Russia invade a neighbor, another post-Soviet country, is bound to make you somewhat uncomfortable, if not terrified. So that's the first moment I'd like to single out. And also, it's worth pointing out that Tokayev also used that time, that particular trip to St. Petersburg, to say, first of one, that Kazakhstan didn't see any need to be eternally grateful to bow down to Russia because Russia was involved in sending troops to Kazakhstan during the January unrest. And he also used it to push back against the constant attacks by pro-Kremlin trolls, pundits, whatever you like to call them. And he publicly used that to say that it wasn't in the spirit of friendship and so on. So this was a really assertive moment. This was, to me, a moment when a Central Asian leader chose to actually stand up to an aggressive Vladimir Putin, not aggressive on that stage, but you know, generally an aggressive president country. So a really a moment when you can say, wow, things really are changing. Moving on, I'd like to just stop on a moment when Xi Jinping flew into Central Asia in September. His first trip out of the country since the pandemic, and he was coming for the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand. He stopped first in Kazakhstan and publicly said that China would always be on Kazakhstan's side in the defense of its territorial integrity. Now that was a sort of quite an eye-catching statement, given that there's really only one direction which threats to Kazakhstan's territorial integrity could come from, at the moment, and that is, you know, clearly from the northern neighbour. So basically, you've got the kind of dragon telling the bear back off. So that was another really, you know, kind of a moment, I think, when things really looked as if, again, they're changing. And another eye-catching moment from that summit was Kyrgyz President Sadir Japarov actually keeping Putin waiting for a one-on-one meeting. Now, Putin loves to keep world leaders waiting in order to show who's in control. So the side of kind of the leader of a small and poor country, keeping Putin waiting was really, you know, something that caught the eyes of many Western media indeed. And moving on there, we saw another summit last month in October, the Russia Central Asia Summit in Astana. This was instigated by Russia, and that's interesting to me in itself, because, you know, Russia is, you know, it has certain international partners, but the fact that Russia chose to summon the leaders of these five, you know, countries which don't punch very hard on the world stage tells you something about Russia's foreign policy partnerships or something like that. But what was also what was particularly interesting about that summit was a sort of rant at Putin by Emomali Rahmon, president of Tajikistan, shown caught on video having a sort of more than 5-minute rambling rant at Putin, demanding that Russia show more respect to the Central Asian countries. Now, there was, as I say, a big rambling and a little difficult to sometimes grasp the context, but he was telling Russia to invest more but also show respect. Again, these kind of scenes, Kyrgyz president keeping Putin waiting, Tajik president telling Russia to show us some respect, Kazakh president standing up to Putin and saying we're not going to recognize these territories that you back. These are really something that we would never have seen before February. So a couple of minutes left here. I'll just move on quickly to people and what they think. What do they think? Well, it's very hard to tell. The only thing we have to go on apart from anecdotal evidence, and there's plenty of that from the sort of vicious arguments that are taking place on social media. The only evidence we have to go on is a poll by Central Asia Barometer Wishnick organization, which asked people in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I'm just going to focus on them for a minute because they're the only ones having a really open discussion about this, and were asked who they thought was to blame for the war. Now, in Kazakhstan, 28% of people thought Russia was to blame, and 19% thought Ukraine was to blame. In Kyrgyzstan, only 14% of people thought Russia was to blame, and 36% thought Ukraine was to blame. The others blame a mixture of the West, and a lot of people just don't know. Now, what does that tell us? well, it tells us at the very least that opinion is polarized, and I think it's probably even more polarized, probably perhaps in Kazakhstan, where you have a large Russian majority, and it's traditionally been very much a sort of pro-Russian government. So I think we're seeing a big polarization of public opinion, and that's something that Temur and his team, his government, have to take account of when they are trying to deal with this changing geopolitical conditions. There's public opinion as well, and they're trying to both to kind of keep that in check and to keep people in check as well. I mean, we see them kind of taking action against both sides. Somebody arrested last month for protesting over Putin's visit, and now we see a criminal case opened against a person who is alleged to have made sort of disparaging remarks about the Kazakh language. So we can see changing opinions, polarization, and we can see a government trying to juggle these public opinion as well as trying to kind of cope with this geopolitical shifts. So I've gone over already by 30 seconds, so let me conclude by going back to the beginning. Is there a pivot away from Russia? Well, we did quibble over the language, but I think the things that I've been saying show that undeniably the Central Asian states are really rethinking their relationship with Russia, and that, that nothing will ever be the same, and that it's been a wake-up call, and they can see, I guess, that Russia's acting only in its own interest, that it's hard to see that all these things, that the war that's damaging Russia, but also its neighbors, and of course Ukraine, but the repercussions for Central Asia have been enormous. And, I think we can only say that this kind of reassessment of relations and this distancing from an aggressive expansionist neighbor from a colonial power is set to continue, in my opinion, for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction of our session. So now we have Raffaello Pantucci, speaker from our Zoom side. Please, Raffaello, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was going to say, can you hear me? But I can hear my own echo, so obviously you can. It's very nice to join you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's only a shame that I can't get to be there in person. It's been too long since I've been to Kazakhstan and Nygmet, but I'm delighted to at least be able to join you virtually. And also on such a distinguished panel with a really great range of experts. So I will try to keep my comments compact, aware that we have got a lot of people, a lot of issues to cover, and I'd like to hear, frankly, some questions and thoughts as well from the audience. And I want to start by really touching on China-Kazakh relations more broadly, because I think Kazakhstan is quite an important partner from a Chinese perspective in Central Asia. There's a number of reasons for this. First, the natural long border that they share does make it a very important literal partner, because you've got a lot of sort of territory that you have to overlook. There's the human connection. It's always worth remembering that there's around 1 million ethnic Kazakhs that live in China, which, when we think about the relatively small population within Kazakhstan, is of course a really rather large number. And of course, it's a country with huge natural mineral wealth. And when China was first sort of going out into the world, Kazakhstan was a place where it really started, and it looked to sort of develop relationships. And also the nature of the country within Central Asia is quite a strong, large country with substantial wealth, a strong leader who's managed a sort of relatively smooth transition of power, is something that has broadly been seen in very positive terms from China. So I think when we saw President Xi coming out post-COVID to decide to go and visit the world once again, starting with Kazakhstan made a lot of sense. In much the same way as starting the Belt and Road with the speech in Nazarbayev University made a lot of sense. Kazakhstan is quite an important partner within the region, but also more broadly for China. And I think that's an important element to start off when we're thinking about China's relations with Kazakhstan in particular, and what sort of shapes them and what they're going to look like going forwards. There is a very strong kind of underpinning that does link the two together. There are deep tensions that also exist within there. And I think we've seen those repeatedly show up over the years in terms of public protests against certain Chinese projects, against people being unhappy about, how specific deals are being put through, or people unhappy at working for certain companies. This has been a sort of consistent pattern. We've seen large-scale protests breaking out at various moments, reflecting this kind of anger that you do find at a public level that has a lot of different kind of sources, factors, which, you know, we can go into in greater detail later, but I think suffice to say, it's a relationship that's got a very strong kind of government-to-government connection. At a public level, there is always a tension. And I think what was particularly notable, you know, pre the events of this year and the Russian invasion of Ukraine was actually that I think over the pandemic in particular, you'd seen a certain level of tension come into the relationship between China and Kazakhstan. You know, I think Kazakhstan realized during the pandemic in particular that, you know, its economy had become very closely linked to China's. And when China went into this sort of zero COVID lockdown and has frankly stayed in that until relatively recently, you know, it's only recently, I think, that we've seen the border transit between Kazakhstan and China opening up in the same way there was before. You saw a real economic hit to Kazakhstan and a lot of sort of damage and risk. And this caused a lot of tensions. You know, a lot of businessmen would have lost a lot of trade. I heard stories of, you know, stuff getting stuck in Chinese ports, unable to get across the border. The phytosanitary restrictions that China imposed made it very difficult for sort of border traffic to go back and forth. Now, traffic through the region seemed able to go, but the trade that was actually benefiting Kazakh businessmen in particular and Kazakh traders was unable to operate. And so this caused a kind of fraction and a problem. And I think and given how long the sort of pandemic kind of dragged out and is still dragging out within a Chinese context, I do think it made people in Kazakhstan to think a little bit about becoming so reliant on this particular trade partner, even though geography, of course, naturally favors it as a very important partner. I think the other thing that was interesting to note during the pandemic was an article that popped up in 2020 in some online platforms. Now, this article was an article that was part of a whole wave of articles that was published in the Chinese nationalist online press, very much produced, I think it was by a clickbait fight in Xi'an, part of a series of articles that they published, which were all basically saying that all of China's neighbors actually would like to return to China and will one day. And this was something that was very much feeding to a kind of domestic audience in China. You know, there is a very strong nationalist mood there. There is a strong sense within China that, you know, this is something that people can profit from. And while I think we look at the Chinese system as this sort of giant monolith, the truth is there are, you know, institutions within this, and some of those that, you know, sometimes will veer away in some way from what one might expect to be the direct party line. So what we saw from these articles, which, you know, circulated in Mandarin and were produced very much for a Chinese audience, was someone in Kazakhstan got their hands on it, read the article and translated and published it in Kazakhstan. And, you know, this was interpreted incredibly negatively within the Kazakh context. People there saw this article come out. They know that the Chinese media is very tightly controlled and censored, and said, oh, well, therefore, this must be some sort of tacit approval being given by the Chinese state to these narratives. In fact, it was really nothing of the sort. And it caused a sort of ruction and problems at a sort of diplomatic level, which were ultimately smoothed over. But I think the key thing was that it really did point to this ongoing problem that you do have within Kazakhstan and the Kazakh-China relationship of sort of public tension and a sort of concern that does bubble beneath the surface about their relationship with this partner. And while they do depend on it at a sort of government-to-government level in this very sort of strong economic way, there is always this sort of underlying public concern which occasionally can escalate up to cause problems to the government. And I think what we saw during the pandemic was in some ways the narrative really starting to tip, I think, and people becoming really quite worried about China as a sort of crucial economic partner. Now, I think this then brings us to this year, where I think what we saw happen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine was really a switch again on that. And I think the visit by President Xi to Kazakhstan last month really kind of crystallized this. You know, and I think the visit was notable because something that Joanna just mentioned, which was this comment that President Xi made about, you know, being willing to, you know, defend the sovereignty of Kazakhstan. And I think it's interpreting Kazakhstan in an incredibly positive light. You know, this is a signal that President Xi would come and defend them. If, heaven forbid, we saw President Putin do what he did to Ukraine, to Kazakhstan, you know, China would step in and China would stop this and, you know, prevent this from actually happening. Now, I have to say I'm a bit more skeptical about the value of this particular promise, because I think if we look at what he actually said and we look at what President Xi, well, President Xi hasn't said this much, but certainly his ministries have said about Ukraine, it's very similar. And yet we do not see China really stepping in to stop Ukrainian sovereignty being despoiled through invasion. So I think we have to take this with a little bit of grain of salt, but I think it does reflect a real desire from Kazakhstan, and the entire meeting was very much shaped in this direction, to recognize the importance that Kazakhstan sees in its bilateral relation with China, and its desire really to elevate this up to be a sort of counterbalance quite clearly to Russia. And I think the problem that Kazakhstan has is this is a very one-sided story, where Kazakhstan is very keen for this, and China, to be honest with you, I think could probably take it or leave it. You know, I think the entire visit that we saw China do to President Xi do to Central Asia recently was really, from a Chinese perspective, more about a domestic audience than it really was about an external one. This is President Xi doing his big foreign tour ahead of the 20th Party Congress, where he was crowned as, you know, leader potentially for life, but at least for another 5 years, and elevated up into this position. And, you know, traveling to Central Asia before that was a way of kind of continuing to confirm the wonderful successes he's ratcheted up on the world stage by being feted at a series of events in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And this is very much how China saw it. And I think it reflects the broader problem that we can see going forwards, and that Kazakhstan in particular has, which is that Kazakhstan sees China as a really important partner and a really important bulwark in some way against potential sort of Russian aggression. But I think the truth is that China ultimately really is very focused on its own interests, and its own interests are very much, you know, in foreign policy terms, very focused towards the United States. You know, Central Asia is important and interesting to China, but it's not as important as the United States. And the other thing is, it's not necessarily as important as its relationship with Russia. And actually, you know, having said all of this, and I'm going to stop now because of time, but also because I'm conscious that Liz is going to talk specifically about the Sino-Russian partnership. But the one piece, thought I would offer about that is that I think while I would be wary sitting in Kazakhstan to take succor from the comments that President Xi made as a sort of guarantee of Chinese protection, what I do think, however, is that Russia recognizes that Kazakhstan is important to China in some ways, and there are things in stability that Kazakhstan wants that China wants in Kazakhstan, and that is important. And in some ways, that is probably what's going to curtail Russian adventurism into Kazakhstan, rather than Chinese promises of security guarantees. Because I think the truth is that for both Moscow and Beijing's perspective, that bilateral relationship trumps really any sort of regional relationships that they might have within Central Asia. And even with Kazakhstan, as important, I would argue, as Kazakhstan is, within the roster of Chinese relations with the region. And I will draw stumps there and stop, and I really look forward to hearing the other speakers and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pantucci. Now we have, yeah, please, let's give it the hand. Now, the floor is to Elizabeth, and I will put the mic.
You have your slides.
Yes. Thank you very much. My slides are loading as we speak. So thank you very much to KIMEP University for hosting me, to Dean Gerald Peck, and to Mariam and Nygmet for organizing this session, and to all of our great speakers and to the audience too, who we're eagerly awaiting questions from. So today I'm going to talk to you about the China-Russia partnership and what it means for Kazakhstan. So next slide, please. We've seen the partnership between Russia and China deepen over the last 20 years. And when we think about this partnership, we look at the long border between the two countries. We think of the geopolitics, both countries having difficult relations with the United States. We think of the resource trade that they have, China's growing reliance on Russia for oil, gas, coal, and other types of resources. But I would argue that the most important driving force, at least under Xi Jinping and Putin, is regime security for both of them. They see eye to eye on the need to avoid interference in the affairs of authoritarian states and to safeguard their own political power and regime security. Next slide, please. So what about the war in Ukraine? There have been some who have said that that this war has led to some daylight between Russia and China, as China has seen its Belt and Road projects cut short in Ukraine, its Eurasian land bridge rerouted, and its relations with European countries in disarray as a result of this war. So China, like Kazakhstan, does not recognize Russian annexations. They never recognized the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and they haven't recognized the more recent ones. And as noted, China claims to support the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. And so I would agree with Raffaello that here in Kazakhstan, perhaps Xi Jinping's statement was a bit taken in a more optimistic light than it was intended, because China typically says this everywhere, that it respects the sovereignty of all countries. And what China and Xi Jinping really means by this is that China's sovereignty should be respected, that there should not be any conflict on China's borders, especially the border with Xinjiang. And so I think it was a self-interested message that Xi was saying, as much of one of support to Kazakhstan. So there are some differences between China and Russia on the Russian war in Ukraine, but publicly China supports Russia. They've supported Russia at the United Nations, and they support Russian disinformation on the conflict, claiming that it's the United States and NATO that are at fault. There are US labs in Ukraine, all kinds of false statements, and these are echoed by Chinese media. So rhetorically, China is seen as a supporter of Russia in this conflict. Next statement, please. So despite the hopes that by some that this war would lead to a weakening of the Sino-Russian partnership, I believe the opposite has happened. We saw most recently Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi talk to Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, and here's the Chinese readout from the call, where China says that it wants to deepen exchanges with Russia, push relations to a higher level, and sees the relationship as providing stability in a turbulent world. So this is not an indication of any stepping back after the 20th Party Congress, which some were thinking might be the case. Next statement, please. So what does this mean for Kazakhstan and Central Asia? So the typical line of thinking was that China and Russia had a kind of informal, tacit division of labor, where Russia would provide the security and China would provide the trade and investment. And so, according to this logic, there shouldn't be any competition because they each have their sphere of activity, security for Russia and economic for China. However, what we have seen within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that Russia has not welcomed Chinese overtures to create a free trade zone or to create a more functioning economic arm of this organization. And also Chinese experts tend to say that Russia is trying to undermine their positions in Central Asia by echoing disinformation from the West and so on. Next slide, please. So what would it mean if there were stronger China-Russia cooperation in Central Asia? So if the Sino-Russian partnership is deepening, is this going to impact Central Asia? So will we see in the future more substantive cooperation between China and Russia and the SCO? Will Russia accept a greater role for China in Central Asian security? So China has been limited in this so far to some border forces in Tajikistan, some training of police forces there. Russia so far has not criticized that. Well, what if China wanted to expand this to other parts of the region? What would Russia welcome that? But I think that we're unlikely to see this kind of deepening in Central Asia And the assumptions that we usually bring to this are incorrect in my view. I don't think that just because Russia is weakened by the war in Ukraine, it's going to suddenly accept greater Chinese influence in Central Asia and elsewhere. Certainly in the Arctic region, another place that I study, we have not seen this, where Russia is trying to find other investors apart from China in that region. And this also assumes that Central Asian states don't have views of their own and interests of their own, and they're somehow the playing field for China and Russia. But you know, it's been fascinating spending time here in Kazakhstan to see how in Kazakhstan foreign policy is being debated and the different interests that are at stake. And so I think that's a very faulty assumption. Next slide, please. So Kazakhstan is known for its multi-vector foreign policy. Will this partnership between China and Russia make this impossible to develop further? It's true that the more the two countries are in lockstep, the less strategic space Kazakhstan has. However, Kazakhstan doesn't view China and Russia as an amalgamation, as a one whole. They see here people in Kazakhstan, officials in Kazakhstan, see two separate countries with different challenges for Kazakhstan, and they treat the different countries differently and separately. Next slide. This is my last slide, because I realize others need to speak. So what are the options for Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries? In the US, people are fascinated by the wedge idea, that somehow we can pry Russia and China away from one another. But I don't think this is a possibility, because Russia and China, as I said, are united by their desire for regime security. And in any case, they have different interests in Central Asia themselves, and Central Asian states respond differently. So I don't think that outsiders trying to draw China and Russia apart is an effective strategy. But there are some options here in terms of engaging with Kazakhstan and other Central Asian states from outside the region and within the region. So you have states like Turkey doing this, so that they're alternatives to the two big neighbors on the borders. But we need more consistent engagement by outside countries like the US, EU, Japan, South Korea, and India. And these countries need to think strategically and in concert to avoid competing among themselves and overlapping interests. So last slide, please. So thank you, Raffaello.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. And now floor is to Nargis Kassenova. Nargis, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Nygmet. Well, it's great to be back at KIMAP, at least virtually. A lot has been said already. I was asked to speak about Kazakhstan's response to the ongoing developments and to the Russia, China, what they're doing in Eurasia, in the post-Soviet space, and so on. And a lot has been said already by my co-panelists. So let me just give a couple of points. Well, Kazakhstan's foreign policy has been very consistent over the past 3 decades, and the main principles were multivectoralism, multilateralism, openness to the outside world, integration into the global political system, global markets. And that's something we saw in the latest foreign policy that was adopted in foreign policy concept that was adopted in 2020. So this approach, of course, got quite a jolt by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the main goal for the Kazakh government now is to maintain this course as much as possible. But of course, to maintain it now, Kazakhstan's foreign policy community needs to kind of to work frantically because the equilibrium is broken. The equilibrium is broken in the post-Soviet space because Russia is the core of this post-Soviet political and security order that we've had. The equilibrium is broken in the kind of broader Eurasia and in the world, because we see this growing big divisions between Russia and the West. Russia is isolated from the West. It is isolating from the West. The kind of this balance between Russia and China in Eurasia is shifting as well. So a lot is going on, and Kazakhstan is trying to find this new equilibrium. And Russia obviously is an extremely important partner, neighbor for Kazakhstan. It is the kind of the thickest vector in Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy. And well, everybody in this audience knows that Kazakhstan has been an enthusiastic partner in all Russia-led organizations. It is a member of the CSTO. It is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So it's been kind of together all these years. And now Russia is going awry, and it's going in a direction that Kazakhstan doesn't want to go. And it's going in the wrong direction politically. It is turning kind of into this partial pariah state. Its economy is becoming toxic. Well, apart from going down, so Kazakhstan doesn't want to go under, together with Russia, but at the same time, it wants to maintain good relations with Russia because there are plenty of vulnerabilities. And then, it is it's a God-given neighbor, as our officials have been saying. And it's a very difficult, obviously, it's a very difficult act to perform. So what Kazakhstani government leadership have been doing? They have been kind of trying to pretend that things are normal in Kazakhstan-Russia relations, and that all these arrangements we have, they're working, they're developing. Our president or prime ministers and ministers, they go to all the meetings, they sign new memoranda, national companies sign agreements with Russian companies, like some new agreements with Gazprom and so on and so forth. But at the same time, kind of doing a lot of damage control and like assuring the West that we will comply with the sanctions, and that's what Kazakhstan has been doing quite consistently. At the same time, kind of affirming a strong stance on territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that's something we can see in the way Kazakhstan votes in the UN General Assembly on Ukraine-related issues, and we saw it at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum when President Tokayev sitting next to President Putin was, quite clear what Kazakhstan's position is. Well, while the pretense is there, we can suspect that Kazakhstan has been dragging feet in these organizations. The other day, there was a comment by one of the senior Russian diplomats that Kazakhstan is slowing down its activities in the Eurasian Economic Union. So we need to bring Kazakhstan back on course. Yeah, which sounds somewhat menacing, but basically, you know, kind of Kazakhstan is trying to do the right moves, and while Russia is annoyed, I'm sure it is annoyed, and we hear some kind of you know, we hear some voices, and definitely some people are voicing this annoyance. Nevertheless, my hope is that well, the Russian government will be rational enough not to spoil relations with its remaining partners. And definitely Kazakhstan gives some strategic, political, and economic depth to Russia. Otherwise, it's left just basically with China, and good luck with that. So that's what's happening with Russia, and the weakening of Russia gives kind of well, allows for more space for Russia's rise in the region. China, as Raf said, China and Liz as well, China has been an incredibly important partner for Kazakhstan, and it's been always a kind of a source of opportunities. And now it has been a security partner. Now the need for partnership with China is even greater. So in a sense, we are under China's umbrella now, because Russia, you know, there's been always some ambiguity in the relationship with Russia, because on the one hand, it is your strategic ally. On the other, you know, sometimes there are kind of noises about northern Kazakhstan, and, you know, there are neo-imperial sentiments in Russia. So Kazakhstan was never fully sure that everything is okay in the relationship, right? But now it's much more, right? Because we see what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and kind of the way Russia talks about sovereignty of smallest states. So it's kind of the situation. The situation definitely is different, and China is kind of this big neighbor that kind of can help, gives assurances, as has been already mentioned. Well, in response to what Raf said, I think for like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, these are two different you know, countries. For China, Ukraine is remote. Kazakhstan is China's neighborhood. Yeah. China will not allow things in its neighborhood that it would be okay with in Ukraine, and it had, of course, it had important assets in Ukraine. It had plans for Ukraine and for Belarus, right, that are completely undermined by what Russia is doing there. But there, Russia can get away with it. And China understands how important Ukraine is for Russia. That it's something, you know, on a different scale, and the kind of the motivation is different. I think the response would be much stronger if something happens in Central Asia. As for what Lee said, whether Russia would be okay or not with China's increased security presence in Central Asia, whether Russia's decline means kind of the considerably higher presence of China. I think now China can do a lot of things in the region, actually. I would say Russia is not withdrawing from the region, no. But definitely its cards are weaker, considerably weaker now. And China can do more, and Central Asian partners would want China to do more. And also, well, and we can say that China has already been doing more, right? If we look at security cooperation, particularly, well, China-Tajikistan security cooperation, right? It was already there, and this kind of the shift toward more security cooperation that Raf described so well and in detail in his excellent book that I would like to kind of plug here, because it's really, if you want to understand China-Central Asia relations, you need to read Sinostan. So I think the kind of basically Russia cannot do much. It just put itself into the corner where it needs partnership, it needs alliance with, well, I wouldn't call it alliance, but it needs this partnership with China, so it would be tolerating many things, and Xi is also getting more and more kind of self-assured and even, you know, kind of arrogant in his pronouncements, not only vis-a-vis kind of Eurasian neighbors, but vis-a-vis Russia, but overall in general, you know, kind of it's China's rise. So, but whether Russia would kind of choose other ways of dealing with this, that's a big question for me. Yeah, would it try to kind of sabotage China's projects in the region? Would it try to be kind of a spoiler for arrangements? I think that's the question. That's the question that, and we will see soon to what extent they would need to be respectful to what China is doing and what China wants in the region, or they will kind of try to do something counterproductive. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop since my 10 minutes, I think, are up.
Yeah, let's give a good hand. His God-given neighbor is going in the wrong direction. Okay, now we have Temur Omarov. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to talk in this panel. Nargis has already perfectly described the position of Kazakhstan in, you know, the changes in the international relations here in Eurasia, and I will be talking more about other Central Asian countries. And I want to start with pointing out to the difference that other Central Asian states have with Kazakhstan vis-a-vis Russia. No other Central Asian state border Russia. Maybe only Turkmenistan has a border through the Caspian Sea, but it's not a land border, which is different, and it puts some, you know, pressure on any country that has a border right now with Russia that starts wars with its neighbors. Other than that, no other Central Asian country has that big population of ethnically Russian population and Russian-speaking population compared to Kazakhstan. And no other Central Asian country has such a strong economic integration between their economies and Russian economy. And also no other Central Asian state has been hearing such a tough rhetoric from Russia, from Russian hawkish side of the government and Russian journalists or not so much journalists who work for Russian propaganda machine towards their different actions during after the start of the war. So other Central Asian states are under much less stress, I would say, than Kazakhstan, and that is why their actions are different. And what is also important to mention is that other Central Asian states are not so much integrated into global economy and don't really depend on good cooperation with Western countries and companies. They are not like Kazakhstan, have their top 10 investors being mostly European countries. They don't have that much international companies on the ground. And that is why I feel much more calm while dealing with what is going on right now with Russia. And that is why I think that all other Central Asian countries, except for Kazakhstan, has been doing just enough not to fall under secondary sanctions and just enough not to be put by the international community into one basket with Russia right now. We see that at the same time when Kazakhstan, for example, stops some of the projects with Russian state-owned companies like Sberbank, at the same time we see that in Uzbekistan, the government signs another agreement with the Ministry of Industry of Russia to expand their cooperation. We see that Tajikistan's President Emomali Rahmon himself asks Moscow for more attention to the region. I think Central Asian countries right now are being very pragmatic and understand that their main foreign partner, Russia, right now is in a very weak position. Weak in a way that the value of every single country that still has allied or partnership with Russia, their value is much more higher than it used to be ever before. And Russia is ready to spend much more energy and resources to keep and secure its positions in those countries. And different Central Asian countries use this momentum to gain something back from Russia. We have already seen that, for example, with Tajikistan, Russia is ready to help Emomali Rahmon to stabilize his political regime. For example, the Islam Renaissance Party, the opposition party in Tajikistan, was labeled as terrorist group in Russia. This is something that Rahmon wanted to get from Moscow for the last decade, and only after the war, Russia has done that. With Kyrgyzstan, we also see some political activists being or journalists being detained in Russia by the request of the Kyrgyz government. With Uzbekistan, we also see some growing cooperation. Recently, there was a huge scandal in Uzbek social media when the head of Uzbek Senate, Tanzila Narbayeva, got the Order of Friendship from her counterpart in Russia and said that Uzbekistan will, I would use the Russian word, отработаем, which means we will make sure that we deserve this order. And with Turkmenistan, we also see growing, attention from Russia, and both Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov and Sardar Berdimuhamedov have been in Russia recently quite frequently, and Russian president after the start of the war also visited Turkmenistan. So that there is a potential for kind of allied behavior from Turkmenistan that Russia wants to get. And I don't think that while in Russia the political regime is able to control the domestic situation and be able to kind of secure in its position domestically, I don't think that we will see huge change in Russia's presence in Central Asia. Because I think that the main important thing that still connects Central Asia with Russia is the political elites. If we just take a look at the political elites in Russia and political elites in Central Asia, we would see that this is kind of more or less same people with the same background, speaking one language and having good informal connections with each other. And I think this is something that will continue to bring those political regimes closer together. And I'm not even mentioning the economic dependencies and other dependencies that were cemented in the decades of the Soviet Union here in the region. So while we have all that, it's very, very early to say that Russia's war in Ukraine has destroyed everything and will kind of sweep away Russia's influence in Central Asia. But I do believe that in the long term, of course, this is something that is inevitable, that Russia's influence here in Central Asia would be lower and lower. In these 3 decades, Russia haven't been paying much attention to Central Asia. In the Kremlin, there was this thinking that Central Asia is a region that would never go anywhere else, the region that really depends on Russia, and that is why it's not worthy to spend additional time and energy to kind of expand Russia's presence in the region. And only right now we see the shift in this thinking. We see that Vladimir Putin has paid visit to all Central Asian countries except for Kyrgyzstan in the last couple of months. We see that Russian diplomats are paying much more attention to what is going on here domestically, and paying much more attention to any phrase that any local official uses towards the war in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think that it's already too late for Russia to rethink about its positioning and institutionalizing its presence in Central Asia, because especially after the start of the war, the thinking among the societies in Central Asia is changing, and people are thinking about their relationship with Russia in different ways, and most importantly, they think about their own independency and sovereignty in different ways than the elder generation has used to think about those things. Other than that, it's also important to mention that for Central Asia, it's very important to have diversified ties with the world. And what the region has been doing actually for the last 30 years is to have as many partners globally as possible. At the same time, we can transfer this multivectorism of Central Asia into the attempts to lower Russia's dominance and dependency on Russia. I think every single crisis that Russia has with the West and with the world kind of adds fuel to this process. Right now, Central Asia is also, they're opportunistic about their relations with Russia, but at the same time, they're finding new opportunities that are opening up with other countries. And we see how different presidents and different officials from Central Asia getting their relationship closer with other countries like Turkey or European countries, you name it. So yeah, to put it in a nutshell, I don't think that Russia will disappear from Central Asia in a short time, in short period of time. But in the long run, we will see much less influence Russia in Central Asia.
Thank you. Let's give applause. So now it's my turn, and topic of my kind of please.
Yes.
Yeah, as all academic teaching professors, I prepared PowerPoint. I did my homework. So my topic is identity crisis in Kazakhstan in 2022, and it looks like a bit different from these geopolitical realities, but we understand, yes, that events in Kazakhstan in 2022, they had a lot of external influence, yes? And next slide, please. So when Kazakhstan, yes. It doesn't move. Yeah, when Kazakhstan got independence, you remember, yes, this definition by Marta Olcott when she said that Kazakhstan is a republic of minorities. None of ethnic groups had some kind of presence over here, more than 50%. And also this ethnic type of ethnic component in identity was considered as important, despite of the Soviet kind of unity, Soviet history, all of the things, yes. And we see that Kazakhstan in Soviet times, in post-Soviet times, and in like independent Kazakhstan, starting from, I don't know when, Kazakhstan finally understood that it is independent, and all the people, they understood that something kind of our God-given neighbor is definitely can have their own interest. Kazakhstan has its own national interest. All of the things, all of this thinking also kind of was influencing our identity, I would say. And we understand that Kazakhstan, despite of all this ethnic variety, it was fragmented society. Not only multi-ethnic, but since like Soviet Union, we had really kind of privileged, non-privileged, Kazakh-speaking, Russian-speaking, Russified, less Russified, all of the things. And you see rural versus urban, some of this, from differences, they kind of were becoming divisions as well. Yes, and you see this, as soon as archives were opened, we understood also that it was really divided, contested past. And for Kazakhstan, for our identity, idea is that also common future is important, yes, in all of this kind of, from literature, from practice. Next slide, please. So, divided, contested past, what does it mean? Soviet history was really controversial. Yes, it's controversial, and I put over here Akhmatova's quote. I think in Russian, if you read, you know it. Two Russias will look to each other. The one that put in prison, and the one that was put in prison. Yes, active and passive. Put and was put. I think after this Kandahar events in Kazakhstan also this kind of dilemma, these two different kind of sides in the society, they're important. And with this forced modernization in 1930s, with all of the Sashashaluk events, with huge human loss in Kazakh population, with this full Russification after World War II, with Tselina campaign, Kazakhs, they felt kind of discriminated, marginalized, and it definitely influenced this Russification process very fast. And this imposed unity, I would say, you understand, yes, that whatever resistance was in the Shashilk times, it was suppressed kind of fiercely. Was Soviet Union, was it colonization times for Kazakhstan? Now we kind of, our all this post-colonial understanding right now, I think, hot topic in Kazakhstan, especially with this Ukrainian situation, with this neo-imperial rhetoric in Russia as well. So let's, next slide. I want to demonstrate this field research. Some of you are familiar with it already. We did this conjoint experiment with Dinara Pisari and Dermot Skogins I'm not sure if they're here, but the idea is that I think interpretation I can do with the second. Next slide, please. Because over here, you see yes, that here it was the economic costs of certain choices. 7 to 12% of inflation, 20 to 30, 40 to 50%. And the idea was that we were making a survey and people were choosing between like, democratic choice, status quo, and gradual democratization, and external partners in terms of economic costs. Yes, if economic costs are 7-12%, people will choose over there. We have China, EU, Turkey, and Russia. Yes, and we see that majority of the people, this one, even with the good relations, they don't choose China. Unfortunately, or I don't know, luckily, but people's voice right now that China is considered a little bit with really concern. If situation is good, still Russia is EU and Turkey, they will become China. Yes, even in worst scenarios of 20-30% of inflation, 40 to 50%, you see over there, yes, EU, Turkey, and Russia. Russian ties maintain to them. And interesting enough that Turkey, EU, and Russia, in all scenarios, they more or less keep the same type of preferences of people. And it was kind of choice of the people in terms of economic costs and preference for external partners. For democracy, it was also very interesting because you see this with this low inflation, people support democracy more in a sense, yes? With higher inflation, they support less, but even with the highest inflation, a lot of people still support democratic transition. And you see, in terms of like gradual democratization and this transition to democracy, people, maybe they don't know what is democracy because we didn't have this experience only in the beginning of the 90s. But still, people, they are kind of fed up with all of it. And this survey was done in June, July of 2022. Pretty recent, I would say. Keeping status quo only with a low kind of economic cost, some people, they choose to keep the status quo. Okay, we can move to next slide, I think. And you see, it's our kind of geopolitical destiny to be between all of these big countries, God-given neighbors. Yes, but the idea is that society is kind of still divided in this issue. We have seen, yes, this economic cost plus choosing external ally. People kind of still, Kazakhstani society hasn't made any kind of real choice. Maybe it's, as I said, it's historical destiny. And still other factors for internal divide, they're here. And again, it's, as I said, under contact, our bloody January events, people are, they are, I think, really frustrated what happened. Yes, and a lot of different kind of, all the different groups in the society, they have their own concerns. The absence of governance, yes, ability of the political class to put on stake stability, lives, and sovereignty of the nation as well. And first of all, like severity of all of this oppression, tortures afterwards. It was a lot of, I mean, it's a divisive event. And we understand that events in Ukraine, they really outshadowed from the contact. But still, to address this issue, it's still not addressed in a sense. Yes, we're in Ukraine, and we understand that Kazakh society sympathy and antipathy to Russia in Kazakhstan is also, we are not talking about only northern Kazakhstan. A lot of people, they have sincere support for Putin in Kazakhstan, not on political, I mean, I think Raffaello Pantucci said, or Temur, that they have some kind of commonalities, our political class, they were going to the same school, all of them kind of from Moscow, they were socializing with each other, drinking with each other, but still people in Kazakhstan also kind of are divided in this term. So the social network, we understand that in Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, there is really some of this sympathy, antipathy for Ukraine and for Russia. In Kazakhstan, people they're going to court with this kind of statements as well. Yes, they are accusing each other in some kind of propaganda and so on and so on. Now elections are coming, and we understand, yes, that out of the 13 people who applied, who promoted themselves as a for president position, only 6 of them are participating, and it's, for me, it looks like fraudulent again, because of this campaign is not very active. Yes, still there are a lot of questions about this campaign. And now let's talk about, next slide please. What are the groups in Kazakhstan we are talking about? Because still Kazakhstan, when I said in the very first slide, all this privileged, unprivileged, racified, non-racified, in general, authorities, government is considered as separate from people. Yes, it's not because of all this wealth, because of they are simply unaccountable. Power shift happened because of this power transition happened from like first president to second president. But this idea that elections, do they bring accountability or no? Still, it's kind of time to come. Yes, this arrogance from government authorities also, this no proper reaction to Qatar is also still kind of, is not happening, I would say. Recently, yesterday, yes, that the amnesty was declared to like 1,500 people, and then the Joanna Lillis was released from prison. Is it like special gesture before election, or it was under pressure from external actors? We don't know. I mean, it's not kind of, it's not declared. Nothing is said about it. But Joanna, at least he's at home. Yes, coming from rural areas, this idea is that this Qatar showed that division is really deep. Yes, and one of the group in this protest, it was this disenfranchised, poor, and really underrepresented, silenced people. Urban Russian-speaking Kazakhs who are kind of feel, I guess, duality in their identity. All this Ukrainian, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian kind of forces over here as well, rich, poor, generational, gender differences, all of these issues, they have to be addressed, so we will have some kind of not uncertain but common future. Yes. So general future, common future. I would say what people simply, no one wants repetition of these January events. Whatever we say, the social consensus is there. Yes. And the idea was that Russia was involved in all of the things. Again, lack of transparency from all of these investigations, the secret investigation of this our former KGB chairman. Yes, and that's why people like this Russian role. This when Nargis said about this menacing remarks. Yeah, this possibility of Russian invasion in Kazakhstan is discussed absolutely seriously. Yes, and political class, all the officials, they try to pacify Russia. They try to, as it's also said, that crawl away slowly but surely. And we see all of the things like brutalities that Russia has in Ukraine also demonstrate that it's not only toxic, but it's a bit kind of even difficult to analyze what is going on over there. Yes. So idea is that authorities, all these elections as a new social contract, promised liberalization. What happened? I mean, it hasn't happened yet. And first thing about the political prisoners, Joanna Lillis was in prison, Aron Atabek was in prison. Both of them, I mean, Aron Atabek was released. He passed away in 1 month. Joanna Lillis released. We will see. Yes. So we see, and the idea was, when I said this, irresponsible authorities who lost touch with reality, I think it has changed. It has changed, and you see this Qatar also kind of bringing back our authorities to reality and to some kind of dialogue with the society. Now, next slide, please. When I said that people prefer democratic choice in Kazakhstan, yes, in general, main idea is what do they understand under this democracy, all these open, friendly questions. Sovereignty, security from war, internal conflict. Yes, all of this stability, peace is considered one of the most important things. Yes, freedom, prosperity, this language debates as well there. Question on freedom, question on the accountability of government is still important. Yes, this political prisoners' right for free assembly, I think it is also kind of on the on agenda, but still people do not talk. I mean, it's like if it's priority order. question on illustration, these constitutional changes, renegotiation of the contracts which are confidential oil contracts, which are signed on strange kind of in strange times in 1990s. Also, the asset recovery, all of the things. I wouldn't say that it is on agenda, but it's still people keep it in mind, I would say. So we see it's a long way of demands from society to the government. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's also reflecting geopolitical issues. So now before we go on to questions, comments, please.
Wait, I need to.
Yeah, all the mics are on.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Nargis, Department of Economics here at the University. My question is addressed to Liz. The White House, Liz, recently released its foreign policy strategic document. And I was intrigued that in your examination of the Sino-Russian relationship, there was no mention of the White House identifying China as a peer competitor and in some ways a primary enemy, as well as Russia. So if both you and Joanna are my enemies, won't that make you friends or closer friends? In an analogous manner, if you respond to that.
Do you want to take multiple questions? Or how do
I don't have a mic now.
I think this might be one. Yes, the other one.
Okay, thank you for that question. This was a recent strategy that was just released, and the Sino-Russian partnership has been going on for, the strategic partnership is 21 years old, and so they're not responding, the relationship doesn't respond to every policy that's issued by the White House. My point is not that that geopolitics is not a factor in their partnership, but that there are domestic factors that bring them together. And the point I was making was that where they see eye to eye domestically is on the issue of regime security, and that's certainly quite important for Xi Jinping in his third term in office, and for Putin, trying to stay in his job despite all odds. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can you give me a mic? I think this one. People, one of our speakers should go. It's Raffaello Pantucci. Do you have special questions to him? Or any comments about him? If not, let's have like 3 questions to everyone.
Yeah, I think Raffaello wants to sign off. So
Yeah. Raffaello, maybe you have last comments now before you go.
I thought I had an excellent panel and I learned a lot, and it's a shame that we're not there to do it in person, but it was a really rich discussion. I think the key question is, Russia and the changing relationship. But I think clearly it was very clearly articulated. There is something fundamentally shifting, and yet the two are still fundamentally tied together. But I think from a Chinese perspective, I just wanted to echo really what Nargis said about the importance, about how Russia really sees Central Asia as important, and how that is going to play into. And the only other thing I'd say is that think back to history. Look at how China reacted when we saw the invasion of Georgia, how they reacted to the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. There has been a change, but it's not been, it's been a change, but it's been a change in the China-Russia dynamic rather than a change in the China's perspectives on the negative things that Russia is doing. It's more that China and Russia see themselves ever more locked in this conflict against the West, and that's increasingly defining their outlook. But fundamentally, China still doesn't like what Russia is doing in these contexts, and is still very, actually, I think, supportive, frankly, of regional powers. But it's never going to, at the moment, go against its bigger geopolitical interest, which is the United States. So I'm sorry to love you and leave you like this, but it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And I very much hope to see everyone again in person at some point soon. Thank you again.
So any other questions? people we have?
There are two online.
Yes, we have online questions.
Yes, one is is it possible to leave CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union for Kazakhstan?
Is it possible to leave CSTO and Eurasian Union for Kazakhstan? May start. I think Kazakhstan will do as with the Soviet Union. We will do it after Russia, as it happened with Soviet Union. But so far, I think legally it's difficult, at least for Eurasian Union. For CSTO, with this violation, with all of these forced annexations, I think it can be pretext for some kind of process. But for Kazakhstan, I don't see like politicians who can raise this question with the government level, which is today.
Could I just add? You know, I mean, however unattractive these organisations are looking right now, it's frankly more trouble than it's worth for Kazakhstan to leave them. Basically, let's look back to 2014. Where did all that particular catalyst start with Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea dated back to Ukraine? You know, abandoning plans to actually join up with the fledgling Eurasian Union and you know, looking west. So, you know, we've seen what Russia does. What's Russia's vicious reaction to that kind of thing? Why does Kazakhstan need that? I think what Nargis mentioned was the Russian senior foreign ministry official saying the other day that Kazakhstan is putting the brakes on Eurasian integration. That tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Nargis, please.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Yes, what Joanna said, but I think there is also a difference between CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union, and in a sense that the kind of the obligations and the constraints that CSTO puts on Kazakhstan kind of are different from, they are lighter than what we have with the Eurasian Economic Union. We see that CSTO, okay, so it's, you know, some joint military exercises and, you know, kind of some internal kind of agreements on the sale of access to weapons in, you know, training and all that. But the commitments are not huge in a sense that you don't need to go anywhere and fight, right? Like the only operation that CSTO did was the one in January in Kazakhstan, right? Otherwise, it doesn't really kind of intervene. So, and in Eurasian Economic Union, that's a much more kind of, you know, it is a reality on the ground. It shapes realities on the ground in a sense that we have the customs union, we have all these agreements on the movement of people and, you know, kind of, so it's kind of, there is more substance to that. And that's a bigger challenge, I think, to Kazakhstan, how to manage being inside the Eurasian Economic Union with all the regulations and everything, right? At the same time, kind of to do damage control and to comply with the sanctions, and you know, so that's a kind of much more difficult thing to do than stay in CSTO and kind of, you know, letting it be. But definitely Kazakhstani authorities cannot afford like slamming the door on these two organizations in the, you know, I think I would say in the near future.
Yeah, I just want to also add what Joanna said, because whatever we say Russia is strong enough, whatever is said about their weakening in Ukraine, about their defeats, mobilization, all of the things, like all this huge boundary, one thing, it's all of this, like Russia is still 100 million people over there, like military, all of the things, how fast they can move in case of Crimea to unprepared kind of country, it's also, everyone is taking it into consideration as well.
We have another question.
Yes, please.
Will the Trans-Caspian Pipeline be built?
Yeah, Trans-Caspian Pipeline. Who wants to answer?
It was directed at you, actually.
Yeah, I guess it was because of respect I asked our participants. I think this Trans-Caspian Pipeline is very difficult to build because, first of all, for environmental concerns, it's difficult. Gas pipeline is not so environmentally dangerous in comparison with the oil pipeline. When Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan was conceived, it was also abbreviation Aktau Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan. And if it will be, I think right now our government, they said that we will send 4 million tons through Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan. And if it will go through, for Kazakhstan, it will be definitely a good choice. But the idea is that it's environmentally, it's much more dangerous than the gas pipeline. It is one thing. And second, in terms of money, it's one of the costs estimated, it will be at least like $5 billion. Yes, and it will take 2-3 years to build. In 2-3 years time, maybe, I mean, this war with Ukraine, some clarity will be maybe more with this war, what is going on. But I think Kazakhstan should make at least gestures to build this pipeline, to have the feasibility studies. I think feasibility study, by the way, was made like 15 years ago about this Aktau connecting to Baku. And you understand, this why it was not built, because Caspian Sea has had legal status. Now, legal status in international sectors, they are more or less defined, and it's possible to build this pipeline. Question is about money, political will, and again, some real efforts to do it. Technically, it is possible.
Could I just ask for clarification? Does Russia have the possibility to veto that pipeline, Nygmet?
Legal status right now of Caspian and national sectors is defined. I mean, the bottom is divided into national sectors. As I understand, if this pipeline goes not in the water, they dig the trench over there and they put the pipeline over there. So legally, it will go in the on the ground, not in the water. So if it will not intervene to Russian sector, it's possible. At least our government seriously talks about it.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because, I mean, there is this convention, right? The 2018 Caspian Sea legal status, whatever the convention. But there was also an agreement on the environmental protection, which might put some constraints. But I don't know how kind of how strong these constraints might be. Maybe Nygmet.
No, I also don't know what is going on with this environmental things. As I said, oil pipeline is 100 times more dangerous than the gas pipeline in terms of control. By the way, when it was war between Russia and Georgia, you remember that Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan exploded. And this explosion was basically because of some kind of, I think Georgia, they made an investigation about it, and this investigation demonstrated that it was intervention to computer system over there. And I think they stopped pumping station, and it was because of pressure, it was exploded. So with this explosion and this Nord Stream, with all of the things, this toxic part of Russia also makes some kind of concerns about building this pipeline. Yes. I think Russia can be put over there as co-investor as well for some kind of guarantees, but it's also, there is no any information about it. It is too much of cooperation, I would say. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Excuse me for my bad English. Now the Central Asian countries are more interested in cooperation with the West because they're afraid of Russia's aggression and imperialistic rhetoric. Plus, there is xenophobia among the local population, especially related to the Uyghur issue. That is, in fact, the alternatives to the West are not as attractive as before. do you think Western countries will be more demanding on issues such as human rights and democratic institutions? Thank you.
Well, I'll start us off, maybe others want to come in on this. I think there has been a tendency in the United States to see the conflict and the tensions we have with Russia and China in ideological terms, in terms of democracies versus authoritarian states. And certainly that kind of framework is not going to be a vehicle for engaging with countries in this region who are still in the midst of transitions. But I think there is a realization in the Biden administration, at least, I can't speak about Europe on this, that that the administration has to engage on practical issues with a variety of countries, even where we're not always in agreement. And India is an example of that, where we've grown closer to India on certain issues, even though India has refused to condemn Russia's invasion, for example. And so I think it's possible for more collaboration to occur, just despite this tendency towards ideological frameworks that, as you say, can be an impediment. But I'd be interested to hear what Temur has to say about this, because you were talking about diversifying relations.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just add that I think while talking from the Western point of view, I think that right now Central Asia gains more attention because it seems that at least Kazakhstan looks like the only predictable and kind of reliable partner in Eurasia, since Russia has gone crazy and China is more and more isolated and different from where it was. And at the same time, I think in Central Asia there is also a thinking that there is a open window of opportunities that they can use while the whole attention to globally is paid towards the war in Ukraine, and while using good rhetoric and doing some things that would put you out of the Russia affiliated basket, you can get some attention from the Western countries. So I think both sides are using this momentum. And another thing is, according to referring to the question of human rights, I think that in the West, the thinking that any economic bonuses and cooperation would come only after here in Central Asia they will have like ideal democracies that would be following all the rules and having good record of freedom press and human rights, etc., etc. I think those idealistic ideas are already a history, and right now the West also has become more pragmatic and understands that it's impossible to wait for real kind of structural changes here in Central Asia, and only after that come and have some kind of cooperation. And that is why we see some attention and some kind of more cooperation between Central Asian countries and the West. Yeah, thank you. And I see Nargis also wants to add something.
Can I just add there that I think there is often a perception among people in Central Asia that the West tends to, practice realpolitik and pay lip service to human rights while you know, really looking at practical cooperation. And obviously we are seeing a close relationship. Look at all the contacts between Europe and Kazakhstan. The German foreign minister was here you know, only this week. The minister praised Kazakhstan for, you know, for its support of international law over Ukraine despite the close Russian ties, while also mentioning the importance of human rights. But I would just like to say that we have had 3 bouts of violence in Central Asia this year alone, in which there have been allegations in 3 different countries of serious human rights abuses. So, chronological order: Kazakhstan, bloody January. We've had Tajikistan and the Panelists, you know, security crackdown, also lots of fatalities, we don't know how many. And then in July we had violence in Karakoram, Pakistan over changes to the constitution, now shelved, but we have a lot of unanswered questions about all of those issues. And I would say we also have a very, I'm not seeing much willingness to tackle the allegations of human rights abuses. I think we can say Kazakhstan is the only one who's made any effort. We've got a torture trial going on right now, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of cover-ups in those 3 countries, and I think the West should be pressing these countries on that. Thanks. I think Nargis wanted to add something.
Please.
Yes. Can I? Well, I agree with Joanna and Temur. I think the geopolitical logic at the moment is in kind of the predominant one. But at the same time, there is a kind of a good amount of rhetoric of, you know, kind of democracy versus autocracy competition, and, you know, the global scene, and that's what we see in the well, EU strategic document. We see it in the U.S. national security concept that was just adopted, with democracy being kind of this rallying cry. But at the same time, kind of the practical element is there as well. If you read the national security strategy, kind of they leave space for countries that are not democracies, but they want to partner with the US and, you know, with the kind of Western, well, political West. So I would think that kind of there will be a push for more engagement. Because it's not clear what's happening with Russia, what's happening with China. But at the same time, I don't think the democratization, human rights, kind of the agenda will be forgotten, because, you know, it is part of the kind of this ideological package at the moment. But the leverage is very different, right? You have Kazakhstan, and in Central Asia, you have this diversity, right? You have Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that want to have deeper partnerships with the West, because they need to kind of balance off, and they have the, you know, they are interested in kind of plugging more into global markets and, you know, having access to investments, technologies, and so on, and they don't want to be left kind of alone with Russia and China. But what is the leverage vis-a-vis Tajikistan? It's not clear. I saw the numbers that USAID actually aid in Tajikistan was up. Is up now, right? But at the same time, the record, the human rights record in Tajikistan is horrible, right? It was just getting from you know, from bad to worse. So what is the leverage there in a country like that, where the leadership doesn't care about its reputation? We see what's happening in Kyrgyzstan, right? Also, kind of the reputation is getting worse and worse with the persecutions against, you know, activists and journalists, and, you know, what's happening to our island of democracy, and like what's the leverage in Turkmenistan? There, like the stat is so low. So it's a complex scene. I don't think we can talk about like, okay, oh, the West and Central Asia, the agendas are different.
Thank you very much. I also think that West has on agenda right now Russia, Ukraine much more, and so much of kind of it's overstretching responsibility in a sense. So I think, frankly, time is up. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers and our wonderful audience. Thank you very much. I think it was a good one. Okay, that's all. Please, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.